Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. No reason to waste time here. To probably no one's surprise, this card topped the EOE charts in terms of question suggestions. So let's take a look at how Xu-Ifit, Osteo, whatever works in some of the most common scenarios that I expect to come up. First, a little general information. The same effect that returns the creature to play also sets up a continuous effect that removes all abilities from the creature and makes it a skeleton. There's no defined duration for this, meaning that the effect lasts indefinitely. In particular, if Xu-Ifit leaves the battlefield, that won't change anything. Any creatures that it brought back will still have no abilities and still be skeletons. On the other hand, that does not mean that the creature has no abilities forever. Like, if you equipped something like this Fire Shrieker to it, the creature would gain double strike, because there would be two continuous effects acting on it, and the one giving it an ability has a later timestamp. I talked about this a bit in my video on Dress Down and Levitation. Another point, in Magic, changing zones causes an object to lose any connection to its previous self, outside of a narrow handful of exceptions. One consequence of this is that if you use Xu-Ifit to return something like this Nether Shadow, that doesn't perpetually shut off the Nether Shadow's ability to reanimate itself. Another bigger consequence is that blink effects pair particularly well with Xu-Ifit. Blinking a returned creature would allow that creature to regain all its abilities. And speaking of abilities, there are several types of abilities that interact with Xu in non-obvious ways. Let's say that Amy uses Xu-Ifit to reanimate 8 striped bears. Hopefully it shouldn't be controversial to say Amy does not draw a card. But let's go through exactly how this plays out to make sure everyone is on the same page. Xu's ability returns striped bears to play as a skeleton with no abilities. These effects start simultaneously with striped bears entering the battlefield. That is, there's no point in time where striped bears is on the battlefield and has any abilities. Accordingly, when the game checks to see if it entering the battlefield caused any abilities to trigger, it will find none. Now, this concept works both ways too. For example, there's also no time when the returned creature is on the battlefield where it doesn't count as a skeleton. So if there was some ability that another creature had that triggered whenever a skeleton entered the battlefield, reanimating something with Xu would cause that ability to trigger. Well, how about if you reanimate a friendly teddy? Now, normally that card's ability triggers after it dies, which you recall is after the time a creature returned via Xu-Ifit gets its abilities back. Unfortunately, leaves the battlefield abilities still will not trigger because those abilities get special handling. The game looks back in time, and such abilities trigger based on the game state immediately before the trigger event happened. At this point, Friendly Teddy had no abilities, meaning that its ability will not trigger. There's one last complication with this point, which is highlighted with this Sarah avatar here. If you return this, it will not have any abilities, meaning it'll immediately die since it doesn't have anything defining a power and toughness for it. After Sarah avatar dies, though, the game will check to see if what just happened causes any abilities to trigger. Now, abilities that trigger when something is put into a graveyard from anywhere do not get the special handling that we talked about earlier, even if that zone that they got put into the graveyard from is the battlefield, meaning that Sarah Avatar's ability would indeed trigger and shuffle it back into your library. And if you're wondering about how Sarah Avatar got in your graveyard in the first place so this scenario could even happen, I'm sure some of the creative people in the comments section can help you out. What about this? If you return a Diregraph Ghoul, does it enter tapped or untapped? Well, Wizards of the Coast says that it should enter untapped, but supporting this in the comprehensive rules is challenging. The issue is that Diregraph Ghoul entering tapped is a replacement effect, and these work a little bit differently from triggered abilities. When Diregraph Ghoul is entering the battlefield, the game has to decide whether any replacement effects apply to this event. While the game is doing this, it takes into account continuous effects that already exist and would apply to that permanent. The only issue is that this check happens immediately before Diregraph Ghoul enters. Now, that rule I had on screen before indicates that continuous effect that makes Diregraph Ghoul lose all its abilities applies simultaneously with Diregraph Ghoul entering. So the only way that we could get our desired result of having Diregraph Ghoul's enters tapped ability not apply would be if we said that the loses all abilities continuous effect already exists before that point, when the game is applying replacement effects. I don't find this interpretation very satisfying because it doesn't make a lot of sense to me unless you're starting from what you want the answer to be and trying to justify it somehow. And another rule that we'll see later actually does contradict this explanation, but this is the only thing I could come up with that would give the result Wizards has stated is the correct outcome. I talked about this issue before in my video about Containment Priest and Enduring Innocence, so you can check that out if you'd like a fuller explanation of the complications. For now, we'll just say that when determining which replacement effects apply to the event of the returned creature entering the battlefield, the game considers that creature to have no abilities. This would stop ETB tapped abilities like Diagraph Ghoul, but there's a couple of other common classes of abilities that are also replacement effects. Anything that applies as a creature enters, such as Meddling Mage having you choose a card name, is a replacement effect. Now, it doesn't really make a noticeable difference with that card because it also wouldn't have the ability that says you can't cast the named card either. So the fact that you don't get to name anything with it isn't particularly significant. On the other hand, effects that have a permanent enter the battlefield with counters on it are also replacement effects. So if you brought back a Mindless Automaton, it would immediately die because it would not get any +1/+1 counters. Wow, that's already pretty deep, and we haven't even mentioned creatures that have continuous effects yet. We'll start with something kind of tame. Let's say we return this Benelish Marshal. Now, I don't think it would be controversial to say that it's not going to be buffing any of your creatures because it lost all its abilities. Alright, well, what if you return a Magus of the Moon? And, of course, this is a completely different creature, so the ability still works just fine. Well, okay, maybe it's not super obvious why that should be any different, or maybe you have heard this ruling before, but not the explanation. This is going to be a pretty important concept for the next few examples, so I'll go through with a little bit of the background first. Continuous effects in Magic work in a system of layers. Continuous effects are classified into one of 7 layers based on what sort of thing that they do, and they're applied in an order based on what layer they're in, rather than what order the effect started. The effects from layer 1 are always first, then layer 2, and so on. Effects that alter a creature's power or toughness are always applied in the last layer, whereas effects that add or remove abilities happen in layer 6, the layer before it. So the interaction between Benelish Marshal and Xu-Ifit works as expected. The Benelish Marshal loses all its abilities in layer 6, and then in layer 7 it doesn't have any abilities, so no creatures get buffed. Unfortunately, type, subtype, and supertype changing effects happen in layer 4, which means that Magus of the Moon will make everything into a mountain before it loses all its abilities. Even though it loses its abilities in layer 6, the thing that ability does happened a couple of layers earlier, so the Magus of the Moon will still work even through a Humility or a Dress Down or a Xu-Ifit. If you've ever wondered why Mutavault gains all creature types instead of gaining the Changeling ability, that's why. For a full introduction to continuous effects, including the layer system and some other complications that'll be coming up in the next few examples, check out my video on continuous effects in 3 easy steps. Okay. Let's say you returned Graz's Unstoppable Juggernaut with Xu-Ifit. What do you think would happen? Well, it's a little unclear, right? The part that makes all your creatures into Juggernauts is a subtype changing effect, like Magus of the Moon, so that part should still work. But the part that sets their base power and toughness to 5/3 is a power and toughness effect, so that applies afterwards in layer 7. So does this work or not? Your first thought might have been that the Graz would make everything into a Juggernaut, but not change the power and toughness, but that's actually incorrect. This is how it would work if Graz had 2 separate continuous effects created by 2 separate abilities. But in fact, we can see that this is actually 2 separate parts of the same continuous effect. All the parts still apply in their appropriate layers, but they'll apply to the same set of objects each time, even though the ability generating that continuous effect is removed before all parts of it have applied. Therefore, if you return a Graz, all your creatures will be Juggernauts and 5/3. For more information, check out my video on Kudo and Humble. Now, there's a lot of creatures like this Joiner Adept that give abilities to themselves or other permanents, which would of course apply in the same layer as Xu-Ifit taking abilities away. Because applying the Xu lose all abilities effect before the Joiner Adept's continuous effect changes whether the latter exists, we say that Joiner Adept's continuous effect depends on the other one, and therefore applies later. Accordingly, your lands would not get the ability from Joiner Adept. I made a full video on the topic of dependencies if you'd like to learn more about them. Whew, that was a lot of information. Let's close out with a few challenge questions to test your understanding. Would Goblin King buff your goblins if you brought it back? And the answer is no. Goblin King's ability applies in layers 6 and 7, and Xu-Ifit removes Goblin King's ability in layer 6. Because of the dependency between the 2 effects in layer 6, Xu-Ifit applies first. Goblin King's continuous effect does not apply in either layer because the ability was removed before any part of it started to apply. Here's one more. What about Ragos Deft Gastronaut? In this case, Ragost's ability makes your artifacts into food, which changes their subtypes, applying in layer 4. After that, in layer 6, even though Xu-Ifit's effect removes all abilities from Ragost, the Ragost effect still gives all your foods the ability to sacrifice for 3 life, because that effect started to apply in layer 4. Of course, because all of Ragost's abilities got taken away, it would not be possible to sack a food to deal damage to your opponents, or untap Ragost at the end of a turn where you gained life. Alright, well what about this Heliod? Well, its continuous effect that makes it not a creature applies in layer 4, meaning that effect will function before Xu takes Heliod's abilities away. The ability that gives all your other creatures vigilance depends on the Xu ability, meaning that the Heliod will lose that before it applies. Here's another fun one, Realm Right. I complained a while ago about how Meddling Mage was not a good example because it doesn't really matter whether you can choose a card name. The Meddling Mage loses this ability that says you can't play spells with that name, so Meddling Mage won't stop anything either way. Well, here we have kind of the opposite. Due to the same layers issue from previous discussions, Realm Right really would give all of your lands the chosen basic land type, even though it will lose that ability that does that a couple of layers after it applies. It's a shame because you won't actually get to choose a land type as the Realm Right enters the battlefield, for the same reason as Meddling Mage example. So yeah, Realm Right doesn't do anything other than be a 1/1 if you bring it back with Xu. Speaking of things that don't do anything, what if you brought back a Grizzly Bears? Well, okay, Grizzly Bears doesn't have any abilities normally, so let's add an Essence of the Wild here to spice things up. So while Grizzly Bears is entering, the game will decide whether any replacement effects should apply to this event, and the Essence of the Wild replacement effect will apply, and make the Grizzly Bears into a copy of Essence of the Wild. On the battlefield, there will be two continuous effects acting on Grizzly Bears, one that makes it a copy of Essence of the Wild, and another that takes away all of its abilities and makes it a skeleton. Copy effects apply first in the very first layer, meaning that after everything applies, the Grizzly Bears will be a 6/6 Avatar skeleton with no abilities. Alright, now I know you've heard this one before, Grist the Hunger Tide. Officially, in your graveyard, this does count as a creature card, so it is a legal target for Xu. Unfortunately, the thing that makes Planeswalkers enter the battlefield with the appropriate amount of loyalty counters is an ability that generates a replacement effect. And like we said before, when the game is deciding what replacement effects apply to the event of the permanent Xu brought back entering the battlefield, it considers that permanent to have no abilities. Therefore, Grist will not enter with any loyalty counters and it'll die immediately. It won't be a skeleton while it's on the battlefield because something that isn't a creature or a tribal cannot gain creature types, so the continuous effect making it a skeleton in addition to its other types can't do that. The weird thing that I haven't heard from any of the other people who covered this interaction before is that sagas for some reason do not get their first counter from an ability. There's just a game rule that says that happens. So if you rebuy one of those saga creatures with Xu, it will still enter with one lore counter. Unfortunately, it won't have any abilities, so the Chapter 1 ability won't trigger, but hey, at least they changed the rules so that sagas with no abilities don't die right away. Check out my updated video on Blood Moon plus Urza Saga for more details on that. Now, Dried Arbor hasn't got as much publicity as Grist, but for my money, the interaction is at least as interesting. Dried Arbor doesn't have any abilities normally, but it is a forest, which means it inherently has the ability to tap for green. Except not if you bring it back with Xu. The Dryad Arbor will lose all of its abilities, even the intrinsic ones linked to its land type, so it cannot tap for mana. And in case you're wondering about being green, that is not something that happens because of an ability. Dryad Arbor is green since it has a green color indicator, which it still has even after being returned by Xu. And you know what card Dryad Arbor reminds me of? Timber Protector. So, what would you get if you reanimated one of them? It has two abilities on it, both of which will get taken away in layer 6. Unfortunately, that's going to be before either of them will apply, so Timber Protector would just be a 4/6. Words cannot express how much that I wish the second ability of this card were worded, other tree folk and forests you control are green and have indestructible. I'll leave it to the good folks in the comments section to puzzle out exactly what consequences that would have. And we'll close out with this Possessed Aven. Hopefully you all agree that I've saved the best for last. Obviously, for the purposes of this question, we'll assume that you have Threshold even after returning the card to the battlefield. So, to determine its characteristics, we'll apply all the continuous effects acting on it in the proper layer order. In layer 4, Possessed Aven will become a skeleton in addition to being a bird soldier horror. In layer 5, it will become black. In layer 6, there are two continuous effects, one that wants to give it an ability and one that wants to take all its abilities away. Now, previously when this scenario came up, for example in the Joiner Adept example, we applied the lose all abilities effect first because of dependencies. Now this time we have a little bit of a wrinkle though. Applying the lose all abilities effect first does not change whether the gains the ability to destroy blue creatures effect exists. That effect will still apply because it's part of the same ability that started applying in layer 5, and it'll therefore continue to apply to the same set of objects in each subsequent layer even if it gets removed. Because no dependency exists between the two ability adding and removing effects that we want to apply in layer 6, we resort to timestamps. Now, I kind of glossed over this point in the Ragost example because it wasn't relevant, but it certainly is relevant here. The timestamp of a continuous effect is generally when the effect started, and it's a tiebreaker if two effects are in the same layer but they don't have any dependency relation. However, we can see that continuous effects generated by the resolution of an ability, like Xu-Ifits, receive a timestamp at the time they're created, and continuous effects generated by the static abilities, such as Possessed Avens, have the same timestamp as the permanent that they're on, which, what do you know, is the time that permanent entered the battlefield. And so, yeah, they're both going to be at the same time. But we have this new rule that was created specifically for this scenario that says the continuous effect from Possessed Avens ability applies first. This means the Possessed Aven will gain the ability to destroy blue creatures before losing all its abilities. Unfortunately, this rule also seems to suggest that the continuous effect that makes the returned creature lose all abilities does not exist before that creature enters the battlefield, which contradicts the explanation that I gave earlier about how it was able to stop replacement effects the creature has from applying. Anyone who can come up with a satisfactorily rigorous explanation for why Xu-Ifit can suppress ETB replacement effects the way WotC says that it can will officially receive my support if they ever want to go for the position of rules manager or something. And lastly, of course, yes, in layer 7, the Possessed Aven will be getting +1/+1, for the same reason why its ability adding effect was able to apply. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.